the stolen pension. I bought their entire debt and became their worst nightmare. I am William Dalton, 69 years old, and for the last 2 decades I lived my life as a ghost. I drove a rusted 2004 pickup truck that sputtered when it rained, wore faded flannel shirts with frayed collars, and lived in a modest suburban house where the floorboards creaked under every step. I raised my daughter Sarah entirely on my own after my beloved wife Mary passed away from cancer. We had absolutely nothing. Back then, I worked grueling 14-hour shifts just to keep the heat on during the freezing winters. I sacrificed my youth, my health, and my sleep to ensure she never went hungry. But as I sat at table 84 at her grand wedding reception, tucked away in the darkest, most irrelevant corner of the massive ballroom right next to the swinging kitchen doors, I realized that my sacrifices had meant absolutely nothing. Every time a waiter rushed out with a silver tray of expensive hors d'oeuvres, the heavy wooden door would aggressively bump against the back of my chair. I didn't complain. I simply sat quietly, resting my rough, calloused hands on the cheap white tablecloth. The rest of the tables in the room were draped in imported silk, reserved for the so-called elite of the city. Apparently, the father of the bride did not qualify for the upgrade. I watched Sarah glowing in her custom silk gown, twirling beautifully under a massive crystal chandelier that looked like it was forged from crushed diamonds. She looked exactly like her mother. My heart swelled with a foolish, lingering paternal pride, completely ignoring the fact that she had barely spoken 2 words to me all evening. Then, the heavy, suffocating scent of $100 scotch and aggressive designer cologne hit my senses before the man even opened his mouth. Richard Kensington, the father of the groom, the patriarch of the family that my daughter was so desperate to join. Richard stood over my small table, swaying slightly, looking down at me as if I were a permanent stain on the polished marble floor. He didn't offer his hand. He just sneered at the tight shoulders of my rented tuxedo. "Dalton," Richard said, his voice dripping with absolute, unadulterated condescension. "What are you still doing here? The dinner service concluded 20 minutes ago. We are about to begin the VIP corporate photographs for the financial press." I looked up at him calmly, refusing to let his arrogance intimidate me. "I am waiting for the father-daughter dance, Richard. It is customary for the father of the bride to stay until the absolute end of the wedding." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh that immediately drew the attention of the surrounding high society tables. Wealthy executives and politicians turned their heads, their eyes filled with cold amusement. "The father of the bride," he mocked loudly, making sure his wealthy friends could hear every single humiliating word. "Look around you, old man. Look at the real estate moguls, the politicians, the true titans of industry in this room. You are a retired nobody sitting in a cheap rented suit. You are ruining the aesthetic of my family's legacy just by breathing the air in this room. I want you out before the photographers turn their lenses this way." I felt a slow, steady burn ignite in the center of my chest. He was talking about the legacy of a room that I had practically financed. Through the grueling years of what Sarah thought was a modest construction job, I had paid for her entire Ivy League college tuition in pure cash. Just yesterday, when Sarah called me, crying uncontrollably because Richard refused to cover the $50,000 floral arrangement, claiming it was strictly out of his budget, I had quietly written the check to the florist so my little girl could have her dream. The very exotic orchids Richard was proudly standing next to were paid for by my calloused hands. Before I could explain this absolute reality to him, I saw Sarah approaching. My heart lifted for a brief, pathetic second. My daughter was coming to intervene. She gathered her massive white skirt and hurried over to our dark corner. I gave her a reassuring smile, fully expecting her to tell her arrogant new father-in-law to back off and respect her family. Instead, she leaned down, completely refusing to make eye contact with me. "Dad, please just go," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with deep embarrassment. "You are making Richard incredibly uncomfortable, and Brad is getting upset. Just take a cab home." The words hit me harder than a physical punch to the gut. I stared at my only child, the girl I had raised entirely on my own since she was 7 years old. I remembered the endless nights I stayed up helping her with advanced math homework. The weekends I sacrificed working overtime to afford her expensive private tutoring. And now, she was asking me to leave the most important day of her life, because my mere presence was a social inconvenience to her new, supposedly wealthy family. "I am not leaving, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice low but incredibly firm. "I am your father. I have every legal and moral right to be here." Richard slammed his heavy, manicured hand onto my table, making the cheap silverware violently clatter. "You have absolutely no rights here, you pathetic old fool." Richard snarled, his face turning a dangerous, angry shade of crimson. "You contributed nothing to this union. My son is elevating your daughter from the absolute dirt she came from. You will leave this property right now, or I will have my private security drag you out through the service elevator." I stood up. I am exactly 5 inches taller than Richard, and despite my age, my shoulders are broad and hardened from a lifetime of fierce discipline. I did not raise my voice, but the cold steel in my tone was absolutely unmistakable. "You will not touch me, Richard," I said smoothly, "and you will not speak to me like that ever again." Richard's eyes went wide with pure blinding fury. A man accustomed to absolute obedience does not handle defiance well, especially from someone he views as a lower-class peasant. In a split second of blind, arrogant rage, he reached over to the neighboring table, grabbed a heavy crystal glass full of freezing ice water, and hurled the contents directly into my face. The sharp crack of the solid ice hitting my fat cheekbone echoed loudly through the immediate area. The freezing water soaked my hair, dripping down the collar of my rented shirt, and instantly staining the cheap fabric of my jacket. The live jazz band abruptly stopped playing. The sudden, suffocating silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. 900 high society guests turned their heads in absolute unison to stare at the dripping, humiliated old man standing in the dark corner. I stood perfectly still. The ice water stung my eyes, but I did not blink. I didn't wipe my face. I looked past Richard's heaving chest and looked directly at Sarah. My daughter, my own flesh and blood. She looked at me for one agonizing second, her expression completely devoid of sympathy. Then, she slowly turned her back to me. She gathered her expensive dress and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of whispering executives and laughing politicians. She left me there to drown. That single action severed something deep and fundamental inside my chest. The agonizing, suffocating pain of a father's broken heart instantly calcified into something cold, hard, and entirely devoid of mercy. I slowly wiped the freezing water from my eyes with the back of my rough hand. I looked Richard Kensington dead in his eyes. He was smirking, a look of profound, arrogant satisfaction plastered across his face. "Do you really know who you just insulted?" I asked softly, the words slicing through the absolute silence of the room like a razor blade. Richard's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of profound uncertainty flashing in his eyes before he masked it with bravado. "Just a broke old man who doesn't know his place." I didn't argue, I didn't scream. I simply turned around and walked out of the ballroom. I walked with my back perfectly straight, completely ignoring the hundreds of mocking stares burning into my spine. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the luxury hotel and stepped out into the humid, unforgiving night air. The valet brought around my rusted 2004 pickup truck. It looked completely absurd, parked next to the endless line of imported foreign sports cars and custom luxury sedans. I climbed into the torn leather driver's seat and put the key in the ignition. Just as the engine sputtered to life, my cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting a belated, desperate apology text from Sarah. Instead, it was an automated banking alert from my civilian, everyday checking account. The screen lit up the dark, quiet cabin of my truck. "Insufficient fundus," I stared at the glowing red letters. That specific account held the entirety of what Sarah believed to be my meager life savings. $100,000. It was the money she thought I was strictly living on for the rest of my days, the absolute safety net preventing me from starving in my old age. I clicked on the alert with a trembling thumb. The transaction details loaded slowly over the cellular network. A 100,000 wire transfer to Bradley Kensington initiated by Sarah Dalton. My blood ran completely cold. They didn't just insult me. They didn't just humiliate me in front of 900 powerful people. They were currently robbing me blind. The physical sting of the ice water on my face was absolutely nothing compared to the freezing, devastating reality of what my daughter had just done. She had drained her own father's survival fund to hand it over to the family that had just thrown me out like yesterday's garbage. I drove back to my small, modest house in total, suffocating silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't turn on the heater, despite the damp chill aggressively clinging to my soaked clothes. I pulled into the cracked concrete driveway, walked up the creaking wooden steps, and unlocked the front door. The house was completely dark. I didn't bother turning on the main lights. I walked straight into the small, outdated kitchen and sat down at the heavily scratched dining table. The only illumination came from the flickering street lamp outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the faded linoleum floor. I opened my old laptop and logged directly into the bank's main portal. My eyes immediately scanned the digital ledger. The balance sat at a mocking absolute zero. I pulled up the digitized image of the wire transfer authorization form. There it was, my signature, or rather, a completely flawless, meticulous forgery of my signature. Sarah and I had set up this joint account years ago when she was in college, strictly for emergencies. She knew exactly how to replicate my handwriting down to the specific slant of the W. She knew exactly the security questions to bypass the fraud department over the phone. She had weaponized the trust I built with her to destroy me. I knew Bradley had severe financial troubles. Over the past year, I had noticed the aggressive late notices accidentally left on their kitchen counter, the hushed, panicked phone calls he took during our rare family dinners, the nervous sweat beading on his forehead whenever the topic of money was casually mentioned. But I never, in my darkest nightmares, imagined my own daughter would commit federal wire fraud to steal my supposed life savings just to bail out a man whose family openly bragged about possessing millions. A normal father would have broken down right then and there. A normal 69-year-old man who had just lost his entire retirement fund would have called the police in a pure panic, sobbing about the ultimate familial betrayal. I did not cry, I did not panic. I felt a strange, terrifying calm completely wash over my entire body. The man who had raised Sarah, the patient, endlessly forgiving father who wore cheap flannel and drove a rusted truck, died right there at that dark kitchen table. I pushed my chair back and walked into my small, dusty home office. I moved the heavy oak bookshelf aside, revealing a small patch of faded, stained carpet. I pulled the carpet back to expose a heavy steel floor, safe embedded deeply in the solid concrete foundation. I spun the dial, 32 left, 14 right, 58 left. The heavy metal door clicked open with a satisfying mechanical clunk. Inside, there was no cash. There were no sentimental photographs or old love letters. There was only a single, sleek, black encrypted burner phone and a thick, heavy leather-bound dossier. I picked up the phone. I hadn't turned it on in 5 long years. I pressed the power button and waited in the darkness for the highly secure network to connect. I punched in a number that only one other person in the entire world possessed. It rang exactly once before a crisp, incredibly sharp voice answered. "Dalton," the voice said. It was Jonathan Reed, my personal corporate estate attorney, a man known in the global financial underworld as an absolute, bloodthirsty shark. A man who dismantled multinational conglomerates and destroyed lives before he even finished his morning coffee. "Jonathan," I said, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of emotion. "It is time." There was a brief, heavy pause on the line. "Are you absolutely certain?" "Bill, you have maintained this civilian facade for a decade. If we do this, the camouflage is completely gone. There is no going back." I looked down at my soaked, cheap rented tuxedo. I touched the freezing, damp fabric. The camouflage was a catastrophic mistake. "Jonathan," I said softly, "I wanted my daughter to learn the profound value of hard work. I wanted her to stay grounded. Instead, she grew up ashamed of me. She married into a family of arrogant parasites. And tonight, she helped them steal what she truly believes is my absolute last dime." "What are your orders?" Jonathan asked, his tone shifting immediately into pure predatory business. "Unseal the Apex Holdings Trust," I commanded. "Understood, and the target?" "Richard Kensington thinks he is a king," I said, staring at the blank wall of my dark office. "He thinks he sits on an impenetrable throne of wealth and legacy. He just threw ice water in the face of the man he believes is a broke, pathetic mechanic. It is time to show him who actually owns the castle." The elevator doors slid silently open on the 50th floor of the towering glass skyscraper. The reception area of Reed & Associates was entirely white marble and brushed steel. It was a cold, clinical, and sterile environment, designed specifically to intimidate absolutely anyone who stepped off the elevator. I walked past the receptionist without stopping. She didn't look up, knowing better than to ask for my name. Jonathan Reed was waiting for me in the main boardroom, at the absolute end of the long corridor. The room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the entire sprawling city skyline. Jonathan stood at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. Laid out symmetrically across the polished wood were 6 thick manila folders. I sat down heavily in one of the oversized leather chairs. I hadn't slept a single minute. I was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, minus the ruined tuxedo jacket. I wore the cheap white button-down shirt, the collar deeply wrinkled and still slightly damp from the ice water. Jonathan looked at my rough, defeated appearance, then looked down at the meticulously organized folders. He pushed the first heavy folder across the smooth surface of the table. "I told you to wait, Bill," Jonathan said quietly. "I told you years ago that living like a ghost in your own financial empire was a dangerous and incredibly foolish game." I opened the folder slowly. "I do not pay you for life advice, Jonathan," I replied, staring at the pages filled with dense corporate financial data. "Just give me the exact anatomy of the enemy. Tell me exactly what Richard Kensington is made of." Jonathan tapped the open page with his expensive gold pen. "He is made entirely of smoke and mirrors, Bill. Richard Kensington projects the flawless image of an untouchable titan of industry. He throws million-dollar weddings, he wears bespoke suits, and he drives imported luxury vehicles. But his logistics company is completely hemorrhaging money. Kensington Global is surviving entirely on high-interest corporate loans and aggressively overdrawn credit lines." I traced a finger over the red ink. "Go on." "They have lost 3 major international shipping contracts in the last 2 quarters alone, because Richard has been illegally siphoning corporate funds to maintain his lavish personal lifestyle. They are exactly 6 months away from total and absolute insolvency." I turned the page, studying the blood-red numbers that stained Richard's balance sheets. "So he is a complete fraud," I stated calmly. "A proud, arrogant man standing on a rotting wooden floor, pretending it is solid concrete." "Exactly," Jonathan agreed. "But Richard has one saving grace left. His company's stock price is entirely tied to the public perception of stability. And that perception is anchored by their massive 40-story corporate headquarters downtown. As long as they occupy that premium commercial real estate, their investors and board members believe they are untouchable. Richard is currently negotiating a 10-year lease renewal for that exact building. If he secures that lease, he can leverage the property agreement to secure a massive bailout loan from a private equity firm. It is his absolute last lifeline." I looked up from the folder and met Jonathan's eyes. I felt a cold, hard knot in my chest tighten as a profound, poetic realization began to dawn on me. "And who exactly owns that building, Jonathan?" Jonathan allowed a razor-thin, predatory smile to cross his face. "Apex Holdings. You bought that property through a subsidiary shell corporation 7 years ago. Richard Kensington has been writing his massive corporate rent checks directly into your bank account for nearly a decade. He has absolutely no idea that the man he humiliated and threw out of his son's wedding is the supreme landlord of his entire fraudulent empire." I closed the folder and rested my calloused hands on the cover. The irony was suffocating. I owned the very ground Richard Kensington walked on, yet he had treated me like dirt on his shoe. Jonathan opened the final folder and pushed it slowly toward the center of the mahogany table. "Then let me show you the true devastating cost of their greed," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. "Let us talk about your new son-in-law. Let us talk about Bradley Kensington, the gold digger who helped drain your account, and the $100,000 your entitled child stole from you last night." I walked back to the table and looked closely at the documents. It was a complete digital trace of the wire transfer Sarah had fraudulently initiated using my forged signature. "Bradley is not just bad at managing his personal finances," Jonathan explained. He has a severe and uncontrollable gambling addiction. But he doesn't play at licensed casinos, where he can simply declare bankruptcy and walk away. He plays in underground, high-stakes poker rooms run by some very dangerous people. Jonathan pointed to a specific offshore routing number, highlighted in bright yellow on the page. That 100,000 did not go to a domestic bank to pay off a mortgage or a luxury car loan. It was wired directly to an untraceable offshore account controlled by a notorious loan shark syndicate operating out of Macau. Sarah stole your supposed life savings to keep violent men with weapons from showing up at her new suburban mansion. I stared intently at the offshore account number. My own daughter had committed federal wire fraud to pay off violent international criminals. And here is the absolute hook, Jonathan continued, his eyes locking onto mine with fierce intensity. That $100,000 was just a good faith payment to keep them from breaking his legs. Bradley still owes the syndicate $500,000. He is drowning, Bill. The syndicate is calling in the entire debt by the end of the month. The Kensington family is completely out of liquid cash, and Richard refuses to liquidate his failing company's remaining assets to save his son from the streets. Bradley is utterly desperate, and Sarah is now legally tied to his fraudulent financial maneuvers. The entire picture suddenly snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. Richard was a corporate fraud on the verge of total collapse, desperately needing my building to survive. Bradley was a crippling gambling addict with $500,000 in violent street debt. And Sarah, my beautiful, misguided, ungrateful child, was the financial anchor they were using to drag themselves out of the abyss. Jonathan closed the thick folder. We can crush Richard's lease renewal with a single phone call right now. Bill, we can evict Kensington Global in 30 days and watch his stock drop to zero. But if we pull the pin on this grenade, Bradley goes down hard, and he will undoubtedly drag Sarah down with him to save himself. The federal fraud charges alone could put her in prison for a decade. What do you want to do? I stood in the sterile, quiet boardroom. I thought about the freezing ice water hitting my face. I thought about the deafening, mocking silence of the wedding guests. I thought about the back of Sarah's custom silk wedding dress as she walked away from me, abandoning her devoted father to the wolves just to save face with her abusers. I want you to buy Bradley's debt, I said, my voice completely stripped of any remaining fatherly warmth or hesitation. Contact the syndicate in Macau immediately, offer them a 10% premium on the $500,000. I want Apex Holdings to legally own Bradley Kensington's life. Jonathan nodded slowly, a dark and absolute understanding passing between us. And the building lease for Richard. Deny the renewal, I commanded. But do not tell them yet. Let Richard print the expensive invitations for his corporate victory gala. Let him stand on the stage and smile for the cameras. Then, we cut the floor out from under him in front of everyone. Let us buy the noose, Jonathan. They are going to hang themselves. I drove my rusted 2004 pickup truck through the towering wrought iron gates of the Kensington estate. The sprawling manicured lawns and the massive stone facade of the mansion were designed to project an image of absolute and untouchable wealth. Just a few hours ago, I would have looked at this house and felt a deep pang of inadequacy. Now, I looked at the imported marble fountains and the perfectly trimmed hedges and only saw a decaying facade held together by high-interest loans and desperate lies. I parked my truck directly behind a brand-new imported sports car. I picked up a dusty cardboard box from the passenger seat. Inside were Sarah's childhood photo albums. It was the perfect camouflage for my visit, a defeated and heartbroken old man, bringing sentimental memories to the daughter who had violently discarded him. I walked up the wide stone steps and pressed the glowing doorbell. After a few moments, Richard Kensington stood there, wearing a tailored silk robe and holding a crystal glass of expensive morning bourbon. His eyes immediately narrowed with absolute disgust when he saw my worn flannel shirt standing on his pristine porch. "What do you want, Dalton?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing in the grand marble foyer. "I told you last night that you are no longer welcome anywhere near my family." I lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump forward, playing the role of the broken father to absolute perfection. "I just brought Sarah's childhood photo albums," I said softly, making sure my voice trembled slightly. Richard sneered and finally stepped aside, gesturing lazily toward the formal living room down the hall. "Leave them on the coffee table and get out. Do not touch anything on your way out." I walked slowly into the cavernous living room. Bradley was lounging on a custom Italian leather sofa, wearing pristine designer golf clothes. But my eyes immediately locked onto his left wrist. Gleaming in the morning sunlight was a brand new, solid gold luxury watch. A $40,000 timepiece bought and paid for, with the money my own daughter had stolen from me just 12 hours prior. Before I walked through the front door, I had activated the high-definition audio recorder on the encrypted burner phone tucked securely in my breast pocket. I placed the cardboard box on the glass table and looked directly at Bradley. "That is a very beautiful watch, Bradley," I said, keeping my posture weak and submissive. "Did you buy that with the $100,000 you and Sarah took from my bank account last night?" Bradley laughed out loud, a cruel, echoing sound that bounced off the high walls of the empty mansion. He stood up shamelessly, admiring the heavy gold watch. "It is a wedding gift to myself, old man," Bradley said with absolute arrogance. "And you should consider it an investment in your daughter's future. She belongs to the Kensington family now, which means your pathetic life savings finally served a real purpose. You were just going to rot in that tiny house anyway." I looked down at the floor, forcing myself to swallow the intense rage building in my chest. "Sarah forged my signature, Bradley," I said quietly. "That is federal wire fraud. Why did you make her do that to her own father?" Bradley poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter, completely relaxed. "I didn't make her do anything, Dalton. Sarah is a smart girl. She knew I had some aggressive creditors breathing down my neck. She suggested we use your little emergency fund to clear the air. We did some creative accounting. She signed the withdrawal slip, and the money vanished into an offshore account. You are never seeing a single dime of it again, so I suggest you go back to your miserable little house and forget you ever had a daughter." Richard walked into the living room and pointed a stern finger toward the front door. "You heard my son, Dalton. Your money is gone, and quite frankly, you owed it to us for taking your daughter off your hands. Leave the photo albums and get off my property before I call the police." I nodded slowly, maintaining the flawless illusion of total defeat. I turned around and walked out, letting my boots drag heavily against the floor. As I walked down the hallway, I passed Richard's massive mahogany study. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. Spread out across his pristine leather desk were 3 thick stacks of legal paper bearing bright red urgent stamps from a major national bank. Even from a few feet away, I could clearly read the bold black letters. "Notter of deaf and intent, to foreclose final warning." I kept walking. Jonathan was absolutely right. The Kensingtons were completely out of money. They lived in a mansion they did not own, ran a company that was bleeding cash, and bought luxury watches with stolen money just to pretend they were still royalty. And Bradley had just willingly confessed, on a crystal-clear audio recording, to committing federal wire fraud, explicitly implicating my daughter as the mastermind. The Kensingtons thought they had just crushed a helpless old man. They had absolutely no idea that the man they just robbed held the absolute power to legally erase their entire existence. I sat in the heavy leather chair in Jonathan's private office while the city lights began to flicker on outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. We had been working for 6 straight hours, building the financial guillotine that would execute the Kensington family. I drank black coffee from a paper cup and listened as Jonathan laid out the intricate web of shell companies we were going to use. I wanted total anonymity when the trap finally sprang shut. "I am setting up 3 separate holding corporations," Jonathan explained, his eyes never leaving the screen. "We will use a firm in Delaware to purchase Richard's corporate debt, a proxy group in London to acquire his outstanding commercial credit lines, and we will route the acquisition of Bradley's offshore gambling markers through a private equity shell in the Cayman Islands. By the time they realize all their debt is suddenly owned by a single entity, the jaws of the trap will already be locked tightly around their throats." "Do it," I said. "I want to own every single dollar they owe to the world." For the first 30 minutes, everything proceeded with absolute surgical precision. The offshore syndicate holding Bradley's gambling debt was more than happy to sell the markers for a 10% premium. Violent criminals prefer clean cash over breaking legs. We now owned Bradley's life, but then Jonathan's fingers suddenly stopped moving across his keyboard. A deep frown creased his forehead. He stared at a flashing red alert on his private terminal. "We have a major problem, Bill," Jonathan said, his voice tightening with unexpected stress. "Someone else is moving on Richard's corporate debt, a venture capital firm out of New York called Vanguard Acquisitions. They specialize in finding dying logistics companies, buying up their toxic debt for pennies on the dollar, and then ruthlessly liquidating the assets. They just submitted a massive bulk offer to the primary bank holding Richard's commercial loans." My chest tightened. If Vanguard buys that debt, what happens to Richard? Vanguard will strip his company down for parts by the end of the week. They will fire everyone, sell the trucks, and force Richard into standard corporate bankruptcy. He will lose the company, yes, but he will be legally shielded from personal ruin. If they win this bid, Richard escapes the public humiliation you have planned. He gets to play the tragic victim of a hostile corporate takeover. I felt a surge of cold anger. Richard Kensington was not going to escape into the comfort of a standard bankruptcy. "Counter their bid," I ordered, my voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. Jonathan hesitated. "Bill, Vanguard offered $12 million for the debt portfolio. The portfolio itself is barely worth $8 million in actual recoverable assets. If we outbid them, you will be intentionally losing millions of dollars just to secure the rights to destroy this man. It is a terrible financial move." I looked at the brilliant city skyline. I remembered the freezing shock of the ice water hitting my face. I remembered the absolute silence of the 900 guests. I remembered the agonizing sight of Sarah turning her back on me. "I did not build a billion-dollar empire to worry about a few $1,000,000, Jonathan," I said smoothly. "I built it so I would never have to bow to men like Richard Kensington. Offer $15 million right now." Jonathan swallowed hard, realizing the absolute depths of my resolve. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he drafted the counteroffer. We waited. 5 minutes felt like 5 agonizing years. Then Jonathan's phone rang. He listened for 10 seconds and hung up. "The bank accepted our offer," Jonathan said, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Vanguard backed down. It is done, Bill. The Delaware Shell Company now officially holds every single note of Richard Kensington's corporate debt. You own the company. You hold all the cards." I stood up from the leather chair. "Keep the transfer absolutely quiet. I do not want Richard to know his loans have been sold until I am standing directly in front of him." The next morning, I walked out to my rusted mailbox and found a thick, heavy envelope made of expensive cream-colored paper, sealed with a prominent gold wax stamp. Inside was a formal, heavily embossed invitation. "Richard Kensington, CEO of Kensington Global, cordially invites you to a grand corporate gala celebrating the dawn of a lucrative new merger and the permanent expansion of our legacy." Richard had not sent me this invitation. A man like Richard would never invite the blue-collar father he had just thrown out of a wedding. Taped to the back of the invitation was a small piece of custom stationery. I immediately recognized the elegant, looping handwriting. It was Sarah, Dad. "I know you are probably still angry about the wedding and the money, but Bradley and I thought you should see what real success actually looks like. The Kensingtons are closing a deal this weekend that will secure our family for generations. This is the world I belong in now. I sent you this invitation so you can come and see for yourself. Maybe if you see what Richard has built, you will finally understand why I had to leave your small life behind. Do not wear the rented tuxedo if you decide to show up." I placed the note gently on the kitchen counter. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal anymore. My own daughter had stolen my survival money to pay off her husband's gambling debts, and now she was cruelly mocking my perceived poverty. She wanted me to stand in the back of another grand ballroom and watch them celebrate their stolen, fraudulent wealth. "I am going to attend your party, Sarah," I whispered to the empty room. "I am going to walk into that ballroom, and I am going to show you and your new family what real power actually looks like." I stood in the center of the private fitting room at the most exclusive tailor in the entire city. The master tailor, an older Italian gentleman, carefully adjusted the broad shoulders of the bespoke $10,000 suit I was wearing. It was woven from a flawless midnight blue charcoal wool that felt incredibly heavy and powerful. "It fits you absolutely perfectly, Mr. Dalton," he said softly. "You look exactly like a man who owns the entire world." I took the heavy garment bag home. I walked directly to my closet and began pulling out the past. Every single worn-out flannel shirt, every pair of grass-stained jeans, every cheap canvas jacket I owned. I carried the heavy, pathetic pile out to the rusted metal fire pit in my backyard. I poured a thick stream of lighter fluid over the mountain of cheap fabric and tossed in a lit match. The flames erupted instantly. I stood perfectly still on the concrete and watched my entire civilian identity turn to black ash. As the aggressive fire began to die down, my secure cell phone buzzed. It was a text message from Sarah. "Dad, you completely ruined the elegant aesthetic of our VIP wedding photos. Richard is still furious. We decided we desperately need a first-class honeymoon trip to a luxury resort in Dubai. Since you ruined our special day, the absolute least you can do is pay for the flights and the private villa. Wire $50 to my new joint account by tonight. Consider it your formal apology." My own flesh and blood, who had just committed massive federal wire fraud, was now demanding an additional $50,000. I didn't type out a long, emotionally exhausted response. I simply typed a single, devastating sentence: "Enjoy the weekend, Sarah, because it is the absolute last one you will ever be able to afford." I pressed send, then permanently blocked her number. She was no longer my beloved daughter. She was simply acceptable collateral damage in the total war she had foolishly helped start. Saturday evening, I drove my rusted pickup truck into the heart of the downtown financial district, pulling directly up to the 40-story headquarters of Kensington Global. A long line of sleek European sports cars waited for valet service. I pulled my battered truck to the absolute front, cutting off a brand-new silver Mercedes. The young valet attendant looked absolutely horrified, stepping forward aggressively to shoo me away. Then I opened the heavy, creaking metal door and stepped out onto the pristine red carpet. The valet stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the cracked windshield of my old truck, and then his eyes traveled down to my immaculate $10,000 custom tailoring. The sheer contrast completely paralyzed him. I handed him the keys wrapped in a crisp $100 bill. "Keep it parked close to the front," I commanded. "I will not be staying very long tonight." I walked slowly up the massive red carpet. Bright flashes erupted from hired photographers snapping pictures of arriving executives. I approached the towering double-glass doors. A team of 4 massive private security guards stood behind a thick braided velvet rope, meticulously checking names on a digital tablet. "Good evening, sir," the security chief said, his eyes scanning the expensive cut of my suit. "May I please have your last name for the VIP guest list?" "Dalton," I replied smoothly. "William Dalton." The massive man scrolled down his glowing screen and frowned. "I am incredibly sorry, Mr. Dalton, but your name is absolutely not on the approved executive guest list tonight. I will have to ask you to please step aside immediately." 2 other large guards immediately stepped forward, preparing to physically remove me. I did not move a single muscle. I slowly reached my right hand inside the breast pocket of my tailored jacket. I pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of heavy legal paper and handed it calmly over the velvet rope to the head of security. "I highly suggest you read that document very carefully before you decide to put your hands on me," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low pitch. The security chief took the paper. He read the bold black text printed across the top: "Certified Deed of Commercial Property Ownership." He read the address of the skyscraper we were standing in front of. And finally, his eyes slowly dragged down to the name of the sole authorized executive of Apex Holdings, William Dalton. All the blood completely drained from the security chief's face, leaving him looking pale and terrified. He realized he was actively attempting to throw the supreme legal landlord of the entire building out onto the street. "Sir," the security chief stammered, his voice completely cracking as he handed the heavy document back with violently trembling fingers. "I am so incredibly sorry, Mr. Dalton. Please forgive the total misunderstanding." He turned violently to his men. "Step aside right now. Open the main doors immediately." I didn't thank them. I simply walked straight past them, leaving the cold night air behind, and stepped directly into the grand marble foyer of my own massive building. The Kensington Global Gala was taking place in the massive open-glass atrium. Hundreds of wealthy investors and politicians were happily mingling under towering floral arrangements. Waiters in white coats carried silver trays loaded with imported caviar. It was a flawless picture of untouched wealth. I stayed in the dark shadows near the back of the massive room, quietly observing the fake empire I was about to completely and ruthlessly destroy. Suddenly, the soft classical music faded away. The bright ambient lights slowly dimmed down to absolute darkness. A single blindingly bright white spotlight cut through the shadows, illuminating a grand stage. Richard Kensington stepped proudly into the bright light, wearing a flawless custom tuxedo and a blindingly arrogant smile. He looked out over the sea of faces, entirely ready to announce his fake corporate merger. He was completely and totally unaware that the executioner had just entered the room, and the trap was about to aggressively snap shut. Richard stood at the crystal podium, basking in the warm glow of the bright white spotlight. He raised a tall glass of golden champagne high into the air. The soft murmurs of the wealthy crowd instantly quieted down. He looked out over the massive sea of influential investors, with a smile that was completely sickening in its absolute arrogance. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Richard said, his voice booming proudly through the massive speakers. "We are gathered here not just to celebrate the end of a highly successful fiscal year, but to ring in a brand new era for Kensington Global. As you all know, the corporate logistics industry is a brutal and unforgiving battlefield. Only the absolute strongest survive, and tonight I stand before you to officially announce that our beautiful empire is completely impenetrable." The wealthy crowd erupted into polite, elegant applause. I stood in the dark shadows at the very back of the room, silently watching him feed his massive, fragile ego. With our brand new 10-year lease on this magnificent corporate headquarters and our upcoming lucrative merger, we are building a permanent legacy that will last for generations, Richard continued. "We are the kings of this city, so please, raise your glasses to Kensington Global and to the absolute power of our family." The elite guests raised their crystal glasses in perfect unison. It was the exact perfect moment. His blinding pride had reached its absolute zenith. It was time for the devastating fall. I stepped out of the dark shadows and walked directly onto the polished marble floor of the center aisle. My footsteps were slow, deliberate, and completely silent on the expensive stone. I walked with the heavy, measured pace of a man who owned every single breath of air in that massive room. As I moved through the crowd, people naturally stepped aside. They saw the heavy midnight blue fabric of my bespoke suit and felt the cold, radiating power of my total presence. Richard was taking a deep, arrogant sip of his champagne when his eyes finally scanned the center aisle. He stopped mid-sip. He lowered his crystal glass slowly. He recognized my face, but his arrogant brain completely short-circuited. He was frantically trying to figure out why the broke, old blue-collar mechanic from his son's wedding was currently wearing a $10,000 suit and walking toward his grand stage like a conquering emperor. "What is the exact meaning of this?" Richard demanded loudly, his voice echoing awkwardly through the microphone. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my chest. "How did you get in here, Dalton?" "Security. I want this man removed immediately. He is a trespasser. Drag him out of my building right now." From the side of the grand ballroom, the massive head of security stepped forward. Richard smiled a cruel, desperate smile, fully expecting them to rush forward and violently tackle me. Instead, the security chief stopped right at the edge of the stage, completely crossed his arms over his broad chest, and slowly shook his head in absolute defiance. "We cannot do that, Mr. Kensington," the security chief said, his deep voice projecting clearly. Richard slammed his fist onto the crystal podium, spilling sticky champagne all across his pristine speech notes. "I pay your massive salary. I am ordering you to throw this garbage out." "You do not pay my salary anymore, Mr. Kensington," the large man replied calmly, "and I highly suggest you lower your voice immediately. You are speaking to the absolute legal owner of this entire property." A collective, shocked gasp rippled through the massive crowd. Richard stumbled backward, as if he had just been physically punched hard in the chest. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no words came out. I reached the front of the room, walked up the carpeted steps of the grand stage, and calmly pulled the microphone right out of Richard's trembling, sweating hand. I turned to face the massive crowd. "Good evening," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady, echoing off the towering glass walls. "My name is William Dalton. Richard just told you all that he secured a 10-year lease for this magnificent building. What he completely failed to mention is that he never actually secured that lease." I reached into my pocket and pressed a small button on my encrypted phone. High up in the technical booth, Jonathan Reed immediately executed my orders. The massive digital screen behind the stage, which had been proudly displaying the Kensington logo, suddenly changed. A massive, high-definition image of a certified legal deed appeared, towering 30 feet high. "My holding company, Apex Holdings, owns this entire skyscraper," I announced loudly. "And yesterday afternoon, I officially denied his lease renewal and signed a 24-hour commercial eviction notice." The ballroom instantly erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs and panicked whispers. Wealthy investors frantically pulled out their phones. "But Richard did not just lie to you about the building," I continued, my voice slicing through the rising panic like a sharp razor blade. "He told you his logistics company was financially untouchable." I pressed the button a second time. The image shifted to display a comprehensive financial ledger heavily stamped with official federal banking seals. It clearly showed $15 million in toxic corporate debt. And right below that massive red number, it clearly showed the name of the solitary entity that had just purchased every single penny of it. Apex Holdings. "Kensington Global is completely and totally insolvent," I commanded the angry crowd. "They have been surviving on fraudulent accounting and desperate lies for over 6 months. And as of yesterday morning, my company officially bought every single outstanding loan, every commercial credit line, and every massive corporate debt this man owes to the world." I turned around and looked directly at Richard. The custom silk tuxedo suddenly looked 3 sizes too big for his shrinking, cowardly frame. "You do not have an empire, Richard," I said quietly, the microphone picking up every cold syllable. "You do not have a legacy. You do not even have a desk to sit at tomorrow morning. By 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, my private security teams will permanently lock the heavy glass doors of this skyscraper. Every single desk, every computer, and every file cabinet belongs to me as collateral." "You did this to me," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysterical rage. "You ruined my family, Dalton." Richard lowered his head and aggressively lunged forward, swinging his heavy fists in a desperate attempt to physically destroy me. I didn't step back or flinch. Before he could even close the short distance, a massive force suddenly hit him from the side. 3 men wearing dark tactical windbreakers, with bright yellow federal letters printed across the back, violently tackled him to the polished wooden floor. From the dark shadows on the left side of the stage, Jonathan Reed calmly walked out into the bright white spotlight. He looked down at Richard, who was currently pinned face down against the floor by the federal marshals. "You are a very difficult man to serve papers to, Mr. Kensington," Jonathan said, his voice dripping with absolute professional disdain. The federal marshals aggressively pulled Richard's arms behind his back and secured heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The sharp metallic click was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Jonathan unclasped his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal warrants. "My name is Jonathan Reed. I am the senior legal counsel for Apex Holdings. The men holding Richard Kensington are federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division. We have spent the last 48 hours handing over mountains of irrefutable digital evidence, proving that Mr. Kensington has been embezzling millions of dollars from your employee pension funds to secure illegal high-interest loans. He is a massive federal criminal." The investors gasped in total horror. Several executives in the front row frantically opened their live stock trading applications on their phones. "Look at your screens," I told the crowd. "Look at the legacy this man built. Within 3 short minutes, the stock of Kensington Global plummeted in real time from $80 a share to exactly 0. The company was officially completely worthless. Take him away," Jonathan ordered, He is ruining the aesthetic of my client's building. Hearing his own cruel phrase repeated back to him was the absolute final nail in Richard's coffin. He hung his head in total defeat, sobbing quietly, as the federal agents dragged him down the center aisle. The crowd of elite guests immediately parted for him, backing away in total disgust. My work was not entirely finished. The father had just paid for his blinding arrogance, but the son still needed to answer for his massive theft. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage, letting my cold eyes scan the rapidly moving, panicking crowd. I was looking for one specific rat trying to flee the sinking ship. I found him near the back service exit. Bradley Kensington was completely drenched in nervous sweat. He was trying to quietly slip through the swinging wooden doors, hoping to disappear into the dark city streets before the Macau syndicate found him. "Bradley Kensington," I called out, my voice booming like thunder across the chaotic room. Bradley completely froze. He slowly turned around, his face completely pale and his eyes wide with absolute terror. "Do not try to walk out that back door, Bradley," I said loudly. "You and I have some very serious unfinished business to discuss. Let us talk about the $100,000 you and my daughter stole from me." I walked slowly down the carpeted stairs and moved down the center aisle toward him. The federal marshals were blocking the main exits. Bradley was trapped like a rat in a glass cage. "You thought you could just walk out the back door, Bradley?" I asked, stopping 10 feet away from him. "You thought you could watch your father take the fall and quietly slip away?" "Bill, please," Bradley whispered, his voice trembling violently. "We can handle this privately. We are far past handling anything privately," I replied. "You lost your right to mercy the moment you decided to commit federal wire fraud, to steal my life savings, to pay off your violent underground debts." I turned slightly to address the remaining crowd. 2 nights ago, my daughter and this man forged my signature on a joint account withdrawal slip. They stole $100,000 to pay a violent international loan shark syndicate operating out of Macau. I stepped closer to Bradley. "You still owed them $500,000, Bradley. And this afternoon, 3 men from that syndicate sat down at your table at the country club. They showed you the debt markers. They told you the money was due today." Bradley's knees physically buckled. He stumbled backward and hit the heavy wooden service doors. "How do you know about the country club?" he gasped. I smiled a cold, unforgiving smile. "Because I am the man who sent them. Yesterday afternoon, my holding company completely purchased your illicit gambling debt. I bought your life, Bradley. Those dangerous men work directly for me now. You do not owe the Macau syndicate anymore. You owe William Dalton, and I am calling in the entire massive debt right here and right now." The absolute terror on his face was magnificent. He had absolutely no money left. His father's fake empire was completely gone. He was entirely at my mercy. Suddenly, a shrill, desperate voice screamed over the crowd. "Leave him alone." Sarah aggressively pushed her way through the crowd. She was wearing a stunning custom silk evening gown, her face red with fury, eyes filled with hot tears. She ran directly toward Bradley, standing protectively in front of him, glaring at me with absolute blinding hatred. "Stop doing this, Dad!" Sarah screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. "Stop trying to destroy my husband. You are just completely bitter and jealous because Richard threw water in your face. You are doing all of this just to punish us for moving on to a better life." The absolute magnitude of her delusion was staggering. She was standing in the ruins of a massive federal fraud raid, defending a man who had just stolen her father's money, and she was still trying to blame me. "I am not destroying your husband, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm. "He destroyed himself. He is a gambling addict who dragged you into a massive federal crime. You committed wire fraud for this man. You forged my signature. We just needed a little bit of help," she yelled, crying hysterically. "Brad is a good man. He just made a few bad investments. We used your money because we are building a massive future together, and you were never going to use it anyway. You just sit in your tiny house doing nothing." I stared at her for a long, silent moment. I felt a deep, profound sadness wash over me, quickly replaced by cold, hard reality. "There is no future, Sarah," I said softly, looking at her biometric lock designer purse. "There is no massive corporate deal. There is no empire. It was all a lie. Richard is a fraud. Bradley is a degenerate gambler. The only real wealth in this entire room belonged to me. The very wealth you were so deeply ashamed of because I didn't flaunt it with imported cars and silk suits. Sarah blinked through her tears, confusion finally breaking through her absolute denial. What are you talking about? Jonathan Reed stepped up beside me. He opened a pristine legal folder and handed Sarah a single sheet of paper. It was a formal copy of the wire fraud indictment. I am talking about the fact that the federal agents standing at the doors are not just here for Richard Kensington, I explained quietly. They are here for Bradley, and they are here for you, Sarah. You actively facilitated the transfer of stolen funds to an international criminal syndicate. Sarah looked down at the federal indictment in her trembling hands. The color completely drained from her face. She looked at Bradley, who was staring at the floor in pathetic defeat. She finally realized the catastrophic mistake she had made. Dad, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking, please, you can't let them take me. I'm your daughter. I looked at the young woman I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. No, Sarah, I said, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth. You made it absolutely clear at your wedding that you are a Kensington now. You chose this family. You chose their greed over my love. You burned the only bridge that could have ever saved you. I turned my back on her and began to walk down the center aisle toward the grand glass doors. Enjoy the legacy you chose, I said over my shoulder. It is the absolute last thing you will ever own. I walked out of the massive skyscraper and into the cool, refreshing night air. The city lights sparkled like scattered diamonds against the dark sky. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 20 years was finally gone. I climbed into the torn leather seat of my rusted pickup truck, started the engine, and drove away from the ruins of their empire, finally completely free.